There is, make say, an international writer, Ofri Togo, Nidin Ede Farida Bemba Naburema. Na watro article afa Afenyo Markin ho. Se munim ensem a ekoswa. Mebo ensem ni mu brief atremo. Ewi a ne yakọ kenkan sa writer yi de watro ede aba. Na ninina His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, the UN resolution ya wakọ ya pasi. Na ye ni enim se ensem we free mu aba ene se Afenyo Markin Ebejina Parliament, betray Ghana. And I call it betrayal. And they say, and there Uncle be now Ghana baso. Say Ghana ya there. I'm even seeing videos of black Americans at mobile Ghana baso. Yes, some of them say, oh, say, but a lot of them are praising Ghana, say, a conversation bia omwenia je say Ghana. Ya shasiye. Ye bo Ghana baso no. Afenyo Markin say slave trade no, ye fault. What ya say? Nti di ntia na yembrofofo no ye kwaka tro mo se omomfa reparations bimbra ono de wontiase and all that. And on a right away ababe tron sama fa Afenyo Markin wo yenko kenkan nti that's the brief. Yenko kenkan ye hwe nsem a eye lady ya friend Farida ya wo free Togo atra fa Afenyo Markin ho. Or say on reparations what the word means, what it does not. Or say on reparations, what the word means, what it does not, and the moral bankruptcy of those who weaponize African complicity to absolve Western crimes. Also, in the wake of Ghana leading a historic resolution at the United Nations recognizing the transatlantic slave trade, the former majority leader and current minority leader of the Ghanaian parliament, Afenyo Markin, stood on the floor of that same parliament in a chamber built on soil soaked with the memory of the very trade under discussion, and offered publicly and without apparent shame the position that Europeans owe Africans and black people no reparations because some Africans participated in the trade themselves. One must pause to absorb the full dimension of this. A man elected to represent a people whose coastline is still punctuated by the slave forts through which millions of human beings were shipped into bondage. A man sitting in a legislature in a country that led the world to a formal recognition of that crime chose that moment, that platform, and that history to perform an act of intellectual surrender so complete, so eager, and so perfectly timed to serve European interest that one is left wondering whether the colonial project ever truly required the consent of the colonized to reproduce itself, or whether it simply needed, in each generation, one adequately positioned African willing to do the work for free. And what tier lady in someone walk I want here say obi ewo Ghana parliament adie we embre we ya Ghana nanka edimpa ba anke wo say Ghana ni ye proud no say nipa kro we kasa asem we just because some Ghanaians were involved in it, you know. Also, the whole of Ghana does not need repair. And for me, that has always been my argument. Because some selected few were part of the slave trade in tea. Also, victims now they don't deserve any reparation. Forget about even reparation in the form of money. But it is not a crime. Just because some selected few were part. It would tell lady in someone walk around here. Say, Afenyo Markin can be our representing Elmina. Your friend say, Afenyo Markin winning by area outside. Okra sa se sukrana, yaba besi fort ne castles ni nyama. And this is what you say in parliament, especially a moment like this. You choose to be on the side of the Europeans, representing Ghana in parliament. Lady Nintiasie. Also, this statement was not made by a European apologist trying to protect his civilization's leisure. It was made by a Ghanaian on African soil, inside an African parliament, using the language of African complicity to hand Western powers the moral absolution they have been seeking for decades. So see, yen can say obroni mpo na eka sa asem we, enye broni, Ghanani, bibini, wo be before parliament, yusu be before kasa, de kasa ansem we, and ye kasama abrofo no. Abrofo ne excuse a omode gi omo ho everybody a wo mo ba be ye no, and the yen nipa na eka bia mo omo. Also, there is a particular species of political cowardice that disguises itself as nuance. Me who say, ebi munso nsemo mba be kan emra me read the comment no. Oh, this is a nuance into the melodies. This is a nuance. So don't no all cannot. That's a political cowardice. Oh, I say nya chuminsem. I say musfra de into you are coming in the name of a nuance. That wraps capitulation in the language of complexity that mistakes the performance of balance for the exercise of thought. Afenyo Markin did not offer a sophisticated historical argument. What he offered is a shield, pre-cut and gift wrapped to the descendants of those who built their prosperity on the bodies of his ancestors. And he did so from a podium that those ancestors' suffering helped earn him the right to stand behind. That is no nuance. That is not complexity. That is the most refined and most devastating form of the colonial inheritance. The African voice deployed in service of African erasure. The son of the oppressed arguing with parliamentary gravitas that the oppressor owes nothing. That is the Afenyo Markin on from what Afenyo Markin is saying. Just like Ghana, ye pledge in the crown on Jin you. Your national anthem the crown on Jit the West need you. And help us to resist oppressors' rule with all our will. And Brana Ghana. Yet this our West no. Share your national anthem emuno. Now why emuna na ye hu omo so omo your oppressors no. Satan ni enim say ye fault. Today, asamwa ba na enija ba na wo say ye nyina ye support aban no, and ye pese ye stress ade na kra no because some few people from us were part in no. Abrofo no they owe us nothing. Hey, and hey, me see omo kasa ade we nyina no. Senya mo ho aye me wanwa no. When I was reading through the comments and Ghanaian say Afenyo Markin is right, Afenyo Markin is right no. Mo ho aye me wanwa papa. Mo ho aye me wanwa rough. Me to me read the comments but me say, "Hey, sasume sinso say no odwin. Hey, obintin to na hey. Engrofo ho aye me wanwa rough." And then a lady na kano. Na kebeba ni say. We akwa say some movie we Afenyo Markin is acting like Bosomfield. Munya ma hesa Bosomofi. Some movie no. I was listening to the Bosomfield no. I say I want to be precise about why this is not merely wrong but dangerous, and why its danger exceeds even the ordinary dishonesty of the reparations denialist. When a European politician or intellectual makes this argument, one can at least locate the interest it serves. The beneficiary of a historical crime has strong incentives to complicate the narrative of that crime. The argument is still wrong, still morally bankrupt, but its origins are legible. I say what they are saying when Nankama Bruni Nenka is that Bruni no what benefit name my a benefit from slave trading, you know. Nankama Bruni Nenka Sasem no. Ye beti as ye, you're wrong there. Now so ye beti as say baby I will free ninti. Now who be bini? Who be bini? Or say the argument is still wrong, still morally bankrupt, but its origins are legible. When an African statesman makes it standing in the legislative hall of a country whose entire modern history was shaped by that trade, whose coastline still bears the fortresses through which millions of human beings were shipped into bondage, the act is of an entirely different character. It is not the defense of an inherited privilege. It is the voluntary surrender of a legitimate claim, dressed in the language of intellectual honesty, but functioning as political capitulation. It provides Western governments and institutions with exactly what they most need: an African voice to quote when they want to close the conversation. So I say Afenyo Markin idea we are wama abrofono weapon. Say African presidents bia koko rezi asem way wo bia. Eno ansa mbe koti Afenyo Markin because oye nipa kese wo Ghana aban mu. Oye the minority leader. So all they have to do is to quote Afenyo Markin or the weapon na show monsa. Tende abrofono betumi use Afenyo Markin the West. And you see, there might be legal issues, and there's a legal issue be bad. Abrofono, all they have to do is that they can use Afenyo Markin in semno, because Parliament is a house of records. Ombe to me is Afenyo Markin in semno. Edi defend your moho. I see, but before I dismantle the argument itself, let me first explain what reparations actually mean, because the confusion, as I said, is not always innocent. It's a young crowd say reparation, no, and they say, yes, ya brofun intia yesika. Dabi, okuja to black I explain it, but on no lady ya or international writer yi, Baba explaining na yati reparations na se. But a reparation in the context of conflict resolution and transitional justice means taking concrete and sustained actions to repair the damage caused by a specific harm. It is not a reimbursement, not charity, and not a check written to make an uncomfortable conversation disappear. Or say you can reparation in this context, sir. And you say, ye take plans so that bibia asebiano ye na adie no ayeye. Enya say yese mo man sika. Enya say yese mo nya ya adoye dabi. But see, when a worker loses his leg in a factory accident, the compensation he receives does not restore the limb, does not erase the years of pain, does not give back the life he might have lived at full capacity. What it does is acknowledge that a harm occurred, that someone was responsible for it, and that the consequences of that harm, which continue to shape the victim's daily existence long after the incident itself, deserve to be addressed in a material and sustained way. The same principle applies when a family loses a breadwinner to negligence. The insurance settlement does not bring the dead back to life. It recognizes the ongoing damage, the disrupted futures, and the cascading effect of a loss that reverberates across time. For my example, obi wo construction site na bone kokoto no wo pra ye mani compensation a enye se ye ka se wo compensation a ye ma no e be sanso ama wo nan na etwa free ho no e ba biom dabi obi di hiewu na ebusuafo ne gi insurance a enye se bia pese etrese insurance le be mani pa kona babak dabi ye acknowledge damage a e cause inconvenience adie na cause wo embrace ni pa krono wo ni ho. This is why the argument that reparations cannot undo slavery or colonization is not only intellectually lazy, but deliberately evasive. Ebi mo so mo ka o reparations na treso mo man yensika na na treso slavery no abi. Enye sa obi anka sa. Ebi mo argument o mo de nam no. Otoaso I was say nobody ever claimed that they could. The question was never whether money or policy could resurrect the dead, restore the kingdoms that were dismantled, or return the 5 centuries that were stolen. The question is whether the parties responsible for producing a documented, measurable, and still active architecture of global inequality have any obligation to participate in repairing its effects. And the answer, by every standard or moral reasoning, legal precedent, and political logic that the Western world has ever applied to itself, is unambiguously yes. Yenina yatiasye. Ene, the entire Africa economy into mean grows they be a developing country. You can't deny the fact that the slave trade has had an effect on us. It is a reparations yenka say omuma yensika. But then yenina yebetumi aya Africa for economy no ebe basro at par. Me hu video bi ananse ya Donald Trump kasa Africa needs to unite because Africa has huge potential. And okeka sansem no. Into reparations no ene say yenina as one no. Ye dia tum say boni a ye no amamo economy no boni a ato ni. Senya ye babe sesa eye egudie efree mo man so embre bi no emma sei ene to mo amamo akechire book bi ana me read embre bi o say Africa kechire over 200 years due to slavery. Inti amamo akechire 200 years. Inti ewo yen ye part no e de ne enso ye betumi aye na amamo nso mo abenim because yen ne amamo kechire 200 years no. Ye can reparations say no. Inti yen ka se ye gisika. But yen ni na yen tenase. Yen hwede ye be ya ebeboa na ma yen so ye economy no epeja. Or say because here is what those who evade this question prefer not to discuss. Reparations are not a radical or exotic demand invented by African grievance. They are a principle that the West has applied repeatedly, consistently, and generously when the victims happened to be of the right origin. Germany has paid billions in reparations to Holocaust survivors and their descendants, and continues to do so. That genocide lasted less than a decade. It financed memory programs, educational initiatives, and political arrangements that shaped the international standard of an entire state. Germany for 10 years, si Israel for so for up to lende Germany for 8 years Israel for ka. And none of reparations. It's a brofoni the omu reparation a ban no more side ya. Omo yo mo ho boni a omo yes reparations yi. Na senior Germany for 8 years Israel for ka. O see omo finance memory programs. Omo finance educational initiatives. Omo share that the sika share education mu say ade we a ya yi ama mo ahwere nkrofo. Ebia na nka mo nkrofo ni bi wa ha na ko mo akọ school. Amendo omo betumi aba be ye mpuntunjuma ma mo Israel mo akoso nti ye sponsor mo nkrofo ni bi ye si we amamo ye we amamo nkrofo ye de nkrofo hye school mu no mu nsua de na at least yenso ye hu se ade a ye edi etua ka no ye kan reparations e bi no nti reparations na ne sika keke e betumi aba ne se allocation kra some of omo best schools no ye ma a particular slot to be a Ghana for ye sponsor more education, ye see schools, ye say. It is part of the reparation and ye initiatives. What you say, political arrangements, programs, training, any nyama. What you say? Or see, no German politician stood up and said, the past is the past. Let us move forward. Germany for aya de we ama Israel for no. Germany ni bi eni wa sorry awaka so the past is the past. Munya ma nenka. Omo ni na ati ase se eye boni a wo mu edi. Nti omo beye no mu de tiaka. No European intellectual produced op-eds arguing that the victims should look inward before demanding accountability. The framework of repair was applied without hesitation because the victims were recognized as fully human. Their suffering was recognized as historical fact, and the responsibility was acknowledged as non-negotiable. The transatlantic slave trade and the colonial period that followed it were not merely systems of economic extraction. They were, in the most literal sense, campaigns of mass killing, sustained over generations on a continent that has never received so much as a formal acknowledgement of the full scale of what was done to it. And lest anyone treats this as abstraction, let us speak in numbers, because the numbers are there, documented, archived, and deliberately kept from the curricula of the very educational systems the colonizers built. We all better share. We are Congo for. Don't the idea omo. On the Belgium for the year Congo for. No Belgium for and the omo to abase they want to abstain. On the year Congo for. Chichicho monsa. Chichicho monsa kokuri. Hey. Me say obi biara wo kasa ade we a ene yenso ye kan. Me say ne de yanka he but more also in the Congo Free State, which King Leopold II of Belgium administered as a personal fiefdom from the 1885 to 1908, a crime was committed whose scale the historical record documents with damning consistency. Demographers estimate that between 1880 and 1920, the population of the Congo was reduced by up to 50%, from perhaps 20 million people to an estimated 10 million at the end of that period. The methods were documented in appalling detail. Entire villages were forced to harvest rubber quotas under threat of death. Women were taken hostage and starved, while men were worked to death in the forest. And the force publicly severed the hands of those killed to prove that bullets had not been wasted. A practice so systematic that baskets of severed hands became the administrative currency of Leopold's terror. 10 million lives, more than double the population of Belgium itself at the time, and a figure that sits in the historical record, documented by missionaries, journalists, and Belgian administrators themselves, and confirmed in its broad dimensions by a Belgian government commission of inquiry in 1919. The Congo for the council na yenso ye kan ho bi yenso ye kan ho bi Congo for the idiomo babe kumo mon crofo that time no population 20 million ye kum 10 million twitwitwo monsa twitwa nipansa afi nipansa ne de to ade but the currency will cronim and all mine. In Algeria, over 5.6 million Algerians were killed during the French occupation between 1830 and 1962, including an estimated 1.5 million during the War of Independence alone. But the violence did not begin with independence struggles. On May 8th, 1945, the very day Nazi Germany surrendered, French colonial authorities and settler militias massacred Algerian citizens in Sétif and Guauma, with estimates ranging from 6,000 to 45,000 killed. In response to demonstrations by civilians who had dared to march for their own independence on a day the world was celebrating freedom, that detail the massacre of Africans demanding liberty on the precise day Europe celebrated its liberation from tyranny is not an irony. It is a statement of how the world was organized and for whom its principles applied. In Cameroon, France waged what historians now call a dirty war against the independence movement of the Union des Populations du Cameroun, a nationalist movement that had preached non-violence and whose founder, Ruben Omniobe, was hunted down and killed by French troops in 1958. His body dragged through the streets and buried in cement to prevent his people from mourning him with dignity. Between 1955 and 1971, around 100,000 people were killed. Entire villages in the Bamileke and Bassa regions bombed by French aircraft. Populations displaced into re-education camps, and a permanent state of terror administered to silence a people who had asked for nothing more than their freedom. Villages were surrounded and set alight. Women, children, and elders were rounded up and shot. Bodies were dumped into wells and ravines. In Bayangam, reportedly, over 400 people were killed in a single night. In Bamenju, the village was razed after days of collective torture. In Banjul, school children were abducted and never seen again. France had already practiced in Cameroon the counter-insurgents method it would later deploy in Algeria, using napalm in Cameroonian forest before it was ever dropped on Vietnamese villages. In Kenya, the British suppression of the Mau Mau uprising, which lasted from 1952 to 1960, likely killed more than 20,000 Kenyans, with historian Caroline Elkins documenting that somewhere between 130,000 and 300,000 Kikuyu and unaccounted for in the 1962 census. More than 150,000 Kikuyu were held in detention camps. Over 1,000 were hanged. And at no other time in the British Empire was capital punishment dispensed as aggressively as it was in Kenya during this period. The British issued a formal apology only in 2011, after former detainees dragged them to court half a century after the crimes, because justice, when it concerns Africa, moves on a different clock. And then there is Togo, my country, a wound I carry personally, and not only as a political matter, but as a family memory. My paternal grandmother once told me how one day she went to visit her family, people she had grown up beside, relatives whose homes she had walked to freely her entire life, only to be told she needed papers to cross a border that had not existed the day before. Overnight, her family had found itself under British rule and been absorbed into what would become Ghana. A line had been drawn through the middle of a people, through the middle of a life, and suddenly kinship required bureaucratic permission. This was not a distant colonial past. This happened within living memory to a woman I knew. As early as 1947, Sylvanus Olympio stood before the United Nations as one of first African independence leaders to make a formal plea for the reunification of his people, a people who had first been colonized by Germany, whose resistance had cost tens of thousands of lives, and who, after Germany's defeat in the First World War, were simply distributed between France and Britain as spoils of a war that had nothing to do with them. Borders that had been drawn, erased, and redrawn over the course of a single century has split multiple peoples across territories administered by different European powers, forcing families to become foreigners to one another, requiring papers to mourn together, to celebrate together, to simply exist in the same room. His hopes for reunification were extinguished in 1956 when British Togoland voted in a plebiscite to join the Gold Coast, dividing our people permanently before two states. I say, on January 13th, 1963, Olympio was assassinated at the gates of the American embassy in Lomé, in what was the first military coup in the newly independent French and British colonies of Africa. Togo had been independent for less than 3 years. He was not killed for incompetence or tyranny. He was killed for wanting to create our national currency. He had been preparing to leave the CFA franc zone and create a sovereign Togolese currency, a move that risked offering a model of monetary emancipation to every former French colony on the continent. And that is what made him intolerable to Paris. 2 days before he was due to sign the withdrawal agreement, he was assassinated. The sergeant who led the coup, Etienne Eyadema, would later seize full power and rule Togo until 2005, sustained throughout by French backing. His son rules us in tyranny to this day. That unbroken line from assassination to dynasty, now more than 6 decades long, began with the killing of a man whose only offense was believing that his country's independence ought to mean something. If that is not a claim for reparation, the word has no meaning. One stories are laid in Walmart. Proper stories are how people have become victims. Years after colonization, how people are still suffering. Sorry, I was saying, so we play the part. You see how Omomoka say, and the Afenyo was right, and the Manasseh was right. You see how I say, lady in some stories are working. Amam, I say, Moasem no, Ababe Hune say, and Ama and Hune say, Asem na ye can a crano. I say, one new win which is I say, one Adane, I say, one more can, Manasseh was right, Nina. Amam, Moasema ye bibi. Because there's a larger picture you people are even not seeing. You were just thinking about Ghana. There's a larger picture and 4 other sides of Africa. But dear, adie we at the year or mono. Dear, they are bow musono. One shedding who at the end of because Afenyo Markin idea we on who the Kessias are going to cancel more kind of parliament. No. I say, and it is not just the numbers killed. Staggering as those numbers are, it is what was done to the living. It is the bodies dragged through villages to break the will of the watching. It is the hands amputated in the Congo to enforce rubber quotas. It is the skulls taken to European museums as instruments of eugenics. Pseudo-scientific exercises designed to cement the manufactured inferiority of black people by measuring bones and calling it scholarship. It is the languages forbidden, the names erased, the gods declared primitive, the histories rewritten to begin with the arrival of men who came with guns. It is the systematic construction over generations of a world in which African life was worth less. A construction so thorough and so persistent that it did not end with independence, because it had been built into the institutions, the currencies, the trade agreements, and the minds of both the colonized and those who came after them. I said, this is what reparations are about. Not a check, not clarity, but a reckoning with a crime whose consequences are still alive, whose beneficiaries are still identifiable, and whose victims are still paying the price. Germany did not pay reparations to Israel because the Holocaust was recent. It paid them because the obligation was real. The harm was documented, and the responsibility was undeniable. Every one of those conditions applies to Africa, with figures that dwarf the Holocaust in duration and rival it in deliberate brutality. Yet the conversation about African reparations is still treated in 2025 as though it were a provocation rather than an overdue accounting. The selective application of the principle of repair is no consequence. It is itself a product of the same hierarchy that produced the crimes in the first place. Now, back to the argument that African participation voids Western responsibility because it must be dismantled with the precision it refuses to apply to itself. Until lady no wakane nsemewie. Until ende wo mo ka so Africa for ya na ye ntino. Ose sisiano or di besimo so or be my explanation tie. The scale the organization, the financial infrastructure, the legal frameworks, the naval power, and the ideological apparatus of racial hierarchy that transformed the slave trade from a regional phenomenon into a transatlantic industrial enterprise were entirely European constructions. Exactly what I told you. Utiele di ninsemu a woka abrofo ni sika wo de ba be shemu. Castles a wo ba be siye. Host atiase sika wo de be she ade animu no e transforme de na e koso de dada no. Emma ne ba be da ne transatlantic ena mama mo atiase se ade ya ye kan ye transatlantic slave trade. Why na ma ade ne ye transatlantic slave? Mo amoka se ene na esi wo Ghana de dada ne ya na ye no. Why mo na ma ade ne ba be da ne transatlantic slave trade? Omo amfa sika apparatus, a dying infrastructure, ships, Mahama meremu na kebe da ne transatlantic slave trade. Ken na ne. Ti mo amoka sansem no de. Me pese me hu kra. As the African kings who sold captives to European traders were operating within existing practices of war and bondage that bore no resemblance in scale or in intention to what the Europeans built around and from those practices. Exactly what I'm telling you. Say, the slave merchants and I him for now no more tongue in Crawford. Na a old system be a war. Ono wakwa kokona we defeating Crawford na ba better than slaves. But no na ya dia koso de dada. It is not the same as slave trade na brofo na de ba no. Or see, the European slave trade did not simply purchase what Africa was already producing. It transformed African political economies, created incentives for warfare, destabilized regions, and produced a demand that corrupted and reshaped African institutions over centuries. To treat this as a simple bilateral transaction between equivalent actors is not history. It is the flattening of history in the service of impunity. Consider the analogy at its most human scale. A child is abused by members of his own family. That abuse is real, it is wrong, and it causes lasting damage. Now, while the child is already vulnerable, a stranger enters and commits further abuse, systematic and prolonged, and of a scale that dwarfs what occurred within the family. Into one perfect example, say akola woni fie ne papa abono enye say ye bo akola nanso compare say akola ne woni fie na ne papa abono no abontinsu ni bi nso aba be chi akola no abona ye ne yakayaka di abono poto funfram ma ende akola no we di dem yakoka say akola no say woni fie kra na ne papa abono ntina abontinsu ni ba be bona say ne papa na ehya ase wa wo kasa asem no me pese me bisa say eto asumu ma wa wo kasa asem no lady ne nsem obeso bisa no me ni lady ne nsem obesi bisa no say eto asumu ma wa na nti Afenyo Markin eto asumu ma. Because wa wo kasa asem ni bia no, that is what you are telling us. That is what you are telling us. I say, would any court, any moral philosopher, any decent human being argue that because the child had already been harmed by his own relatives, the stranger owes him nothing? And no bisano. It will be nyansa obi betina si nyansa ni betina si aka say akola no kra no se ne abu ne ofie deda enti so obi free abonten ba be bona so onye hwe nyansa ni bekasa nyansa ni bi obekasa that the prior harm constitutes a kind of advanced absolution for all subsequent crimes. Inti because ono ni fie no wo no ni ebu ni wo fie ni nti eno hu nti ende wo bi bu na enya bone meboa because ebu ni wo ni fie ni nti ende obi bu na enya bone de sa na mo pesa mo tre The answer is obviously no, because responsibility does not operate as a zero-sum competition between perpetrators. The existence of one wrongdoer does not dissolve the culpability of another. Each act of harm stands on its own terms and demands its own reckoning. This is the basic grammar of moral reasoning that any child understands intuitively, which is precisely why it takes considerable efforts and considerable bad faith to argue otherwise when the victims happen to be African. And perhaps, most importantly, the question of reparations is not primarily about assigning blame to every actor who touched the system. It is about identifying who accumulated the wealth, who built the institutions, who constructed the global order that still operates on the terms set by that trade and that colonization. I see the European powers and the descendants did, and their descendants did, right? The European powers and their descendants did. The African continent did not. The asymmetry is the foundation of the claim, and no amount of historical nuance about African intermediaries can dissolve it, because the African intermediaries did not end up owning the banks, writing the trade agreements, or sitting permanently on the Security Council. Reparations are not revenge. They are not punishments. They are not even primarily about money. They are about the honest acknowledgement that a specific historical process produced a specific global distribution of power, wealth, and dignity, and that those who benefited from the process bear a responsibility towards those who were diminished by it, not as charity, not as development assistance dressed in the language of generosity, but as an obligation that flows directly from the crime itself. It's reparations, or treso say, any punishment for abrofono. Any sika, a honest acknowledgement, say slave trade na a course no. Emma abrofono de building or mukuro inti baby eduno. They also have to, come on board. I know Crown or say any development assistant dressed in the language of generosity, but a your obligation, a your washe, and I was say at DNA see ya amen there were more communities ne or more countries say developing, a your washe and by force. I was say one more a year na African so a developing never better than at par. Those who argue otherwise, whether they are European politicians protecting their inheritance, or African parliamentarians performing a strange theater of magnanimity at the expense of their own people, are not contributing to historical clarity. They are obstructing it, and that obstruction has a cost, paid as always by those who can least afford it. Farida Memba Naborema. A disillusioned African citizen. Me bonse mama lady we nyanku ponshira na papa. Hey, no lady we ye great. Lady we ye great. Nyanku ponshira lady we. Mami nkoti no na menka say. This was a good read. God bless you, Farida. This was a good read. God bless you, Farida. It was your information. Your comment box in Mamedamuni Nase.